welcome to our first interview in our series, Voices in Rewilding. So here we're going to chat to people who are actually making difference on the ground and making nature restoration happen. So we'll be covering the reality on the ground, challenges and lessons learned. So to kick things off, we're really excited to be joined by David Thomas. So we're going to talk things river risk, flood risk, and how nature-based solutions really work. So first up, can you give us a brief intro about who you are, what you do, and all that good stuff?
Okay, hiya. So my name is David Thomas. I am now Principal Consultant and Director at Southwest Natural Solutions. As a company, we were founded kind of early last year in 2025, out of a group of people who had worked at various kind of NGOs and contractors. And a variety of backgrounds like that. And what we were trying to do was to put together an environmental consultancy that could do both sort of the design, feasibility, engagement and advisory elements of looking at nature-based solutions and catchment resilience building, river restoration, natural flood management, those sorts of elements, that could combine that with a delivery mechanism as well. On a personal level, I've got a background with wildlife trusts as land advisor and river restoration officer type roles. I was in the beaver team for a little while as well. Prior to that, I was at regional rivers trust as well, in fisheries team, very focused on riparian corridors, floodplains, in-channel habitat, fish, water quality elements like that. I'm in the fortunate position with the business to have some excellent sort of colleagues who brought their sorts of skills alongside as well, and various sort of specialisms, and we're able to combine that into our business really, and apply those skills and backgrounds to our projects.
Great, exciting stuff. So first question, how do you see river restoration contributing to long-term climate resilience?
Okay, so in terms of climate resilience, I think river restoration plays a real key sort of role, really. We're seeing these increasing extremes, and we're facing those challenges. And there's been historic solutions that we've used, mainly kind of concrete and steel and draining land, to try and manage the sort of conditions we've faced so far. But as those conditions and those extremes worsen, or become more extreme, then we need a more kind of holistic, combined approach. And as we all live in river catchments, we all farm, we produce our food, we work, our infrastructure, everything in our lives is set within that kind of that matrix or that setting of river catchments that are then facing those extremes. Then we do have to consider and explore what could be done to help mitigate against the effect. There's a lot that I'd say could be done in terms of river restoration. There's certainly a lot of exciting projects going on, but also it's not like we're starting the blank canvas of a river catchment with no buildings and no infrastructure in it, and then deciding, right, where do we want to put our food producing elements, where do we want to put our infrastructure, our homes, all of those things. It's like sort of inheriting a system that's been set up for one set of climatic rules or boundaries, and then those boundaries and rules have started to change and shift and become more extreme. Obviously this time of year, and particularly this start of the year, we've seen with heavy rain and with flooding, it's quite a topical thing to be looking at. And I think we need to remember, when it comes to river and freshwater systems, these are incredibly dynamic, and so they will respond and change as a result of those peaks and extremes. But also that gives us a good opportunity in terms of sort of monitoring and appraisal of success in terms of the things that are delivered and put in on the ground and implemented, to see how how those positive impacts can be demonstrated, and we can continue to learn. It's a sort of
Yeah.
positive feedback loop as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Mhm.
So, do you think, can nature-based solutions ever fully replace traditional flood defense, such as flood embankments and dams?
I'm going to say no, and I'm saying no for a couple of reasons. One, because I think that we shouldn't necessarily see it that way. As I mentioned about the
Mhm.
holistic approach,
Yeah,
we need these different elements there because we've already built large large urban settlements. We've placed infrastructure, that sort of thing, on floodplains or in locations that sometimes you look at and think that's not really ideal in terms of what the river maybe is trying to do, how the
yeah,
catchment's functioning. Um, and I think it's important that we obviously protect that those elements that we have. There might be instances where we need to move or adapt some of them, but in the majority of cases, I don't think that we can necessarily move them, and therefore we will always need concrete and steel.
yeah,
However, if we think about it in a hydrological sense, what happens when more water is put down in an intensive rainfall event, when more water than was previously anticipated, perhaps or previously experienced, is put down through a catchment, then as all of our previous drainage systems kind of function, and we've straightened water courses and we've drained land and all these elements, as all that water rushes down, we're putting more and more pressure on those barriers and dams and defences. And actually, the way in which we can sort of extend the viability of, improve the functionality of
mm,
those elements is by employing nature-based solutions and catchment resilience building further upstream. So this is kind of why I say no to can one replace the other, because I see them very much as things that need to be employed simultaneously and
yeah,
function in the collective sense to ultimately
yeah.
offer protection and to mitigate against those extremes.
Yeah, so it's not one or the other, sort of
No, no, no. Yeah,
a combined approach.
yeah, absolutely.
Nice. So, what role should landowners play in managing flood risk, and how can they help mitigate it?
So in my previous roles, I spent a lot of time working with landowners. I was a senior
Mhm.
farm advisor for 6 years, um, and met with a lot of landowners, farmers, land managers, and other people with interests like that. I would say that they're really, really key to this because ultimately they own and manage the land where we know that we need to try and make the improvements, where we need to
Yeah,
locate interventions where the opportunities are really for slowing water flow down, for improving water quality, for intertwining that with more sustainable food production, and all those sorts of elements. So I'd say that they're absolutely key, and continued engagement with them is really important. But there also needs to be sufficient sort of incentive, and I don't mean that just in the sense of how can we convince landowners to do this, but thinking about the pressures on sort of farms, for example. There's a lot of financial pressures on farms, and we know it's not a sort of terribly profitable or well paid occupation. And it's subjected to all sorts of other sort of market forces and influences of supermarkets and regulation and all these other elements. Um, and that actually demonstrating to landowners and farmers that these kind of elements, if supported financially, can become part of the business resilience in a
yeah,
financial sense, in addition to the actual resilience of how the land functions and crop growth and animal health, and then flood risk and keeping the soil in the fields and all these other elements. Um, I'd say it's really, really sort of key. Well, it's intertwined on a really key level. Yeah.
yeah. I think that's a really good point, though, about how you can sort of make it profitable for them and a part of how the business would run. I think that's a really interesting point and really important as well. So, from your experience, what types of nature-based approaches tend to work well and why?
Okay. Um, To kind of answer that, I'd just first kind of want to explain how I kind of look at a river catchment and look at nature-based solution opportunities, which is very much like a jigsaw. And even though the jigsaw is made up of lots of little individual pieces, you need to put all of those pieces together, or as many of them as possible, to give you that bigger picture. And I think it's exactly the same with this. So I wouldn't discriminate against particular areas of opportunity in a river catchment based on scale, because it's that collective strength, that collective impact of multiple elements that will ultimately give you that sort of benefit and the resilience as well, because these things are dynamic and they fail and they change and they evolve, and they sort of kickstart other processes. But in terms of actual elements which work, I mean, some of the schemes that I've been involved in through current business and in previous roles, we've done quite a bit of wetland creation, where we're basically improving surface storage to hold water through creating sort of shallow scrapes, which work nicely as semi-ephemeral wetland habitats as well, and have water purification or improvement of water quality, I should say. Possible implications there. But some of these interventions we might sort of need to learn from, as I kind of referred to in a previous answer. And a really good one to bring up there is probably with flow spreaders and leaky dams. They're a real standard, really good kind of thing that's quite low tech in a lot of instances. But there's always then concerns that what you can't really do with a feature like that is you can't build a leaky dam and then walk away and it's done and it's problem solved, because you're talking about natural processes and timber will degrade over time and that sort of thing. So there are possible ways around that. We do need to kind of consider the management of these things going forward and at the time of design and implementation. But in some instances, there's opportunities, for example, to use things like willow or species that will grow. So then you have a dam or a brush bundle or a flow spreader, which sort of becomes self-anchoring because it will root, and also it will persist a lot longer as live material than it will as dirt. I'm not saying it's a silver bullet and it's not appropriate in every scenario, but exploring those kind of routes and trialing these things as we go on and as we face the challenges is where we can sort of hone in on what works well and what doesn't.
Yeah. So how do you decide whether a natural flood management or rewilding project has been successful, and what sort of monitoring do you put in place?
Okay. So in terms of monitoring, there are things you can definitely do. We did some work on behalf of one of the wildlife trusts down in the southwest in September. Excuse me. There was natural flood management work in a wooded floodplain. In fact, I'm going to look at it tomorrow to go and see how it's fared up to the recent sort of water and storms. But there was data loggers put in by University of Exeter upstream and downstream so that they could look at what's happening on a sort of hydrological data level running through the site. That isn't always possible, and what is probably our most frequently used and most accessible method is to just go to keep going back to sites, to have a long-term involvement where possible, to take that interest and see this very much as, or see practical delivery as an opportunity to learn and understand. I mean, even when I started doing these kind of interventions at the Rivers Trust, we'd see gravels in channel and sediments and fluvial processes respond really, really quickly to a tree has fallen in the river, or we've put in some flow spreaders or baffles or something else. And that's really where the learning and the assessment of success can come. Yeah. There are a lot of people that again, not to mention LinkedIn again, but I do see a lot of people who are able to apply quite scientific or pioneer quite scientific approaches to appraising these. But on a day-to-day level, we tend to be looking at what changes can we observe? Is this
Yeah.
functioning in the way that we intended and designed based on the principles that form the rationale for doing the work in the first place? But sometimes there are opportunities to look at to take samples of water or to put in data loggers and that kind of thing as well to explore that a bit further.
Yeah, it doesn't always have to be so technical.
No, I mean there's not always opportunity for that.
Yeah.
We'd like to do it more, but it's some of that may come down to sort of to budgets and other elements as well.
Yeah. So what do you think is the biggest barrier to using nature-based solutions more widely?
I think a lot of that might be financial.
Mhm.
There's anyone who's been involved with kind of landowners, agri-environment schemes, farming, and some of the associated policy knows that for quite a long time there's been some talk of environmental land management schemes and sustainability elements and agri-environment options that could reward landowners, such as the I think whether it was SW11 or 12, but a making space for water option where landowners could receive an area-based payment for allowing floodwater or possibly colonisation by beavers, for example, or similar man-made schemes to emulate those elements on their land, and that support kind of needs to be there. I'm not saying all landowners are solely focused on the financial side, but it kind of comes back to farm businesses and building in resilience and making it make sense in a financial kind of view for them. But I would say as well, another kind of the big obstacle is often that sort of inherited landscape of infrastructure and drainage and buildings and roads, particularly that have already been put in that maybe these kind of extremes we're facing now and the ones that we will face in the future weren't the main considerations when things were put in. So sometimes there is a building or a road or a railway embankment or something that's really not situated in the best place. And sometimes I'll go to a site and I'll see something and think, well, ideally you do this, this, and this, but we can't do that because there is this other element there that cannot be moved, or there's a difference in sort of ownership or something there that becomes a sort of barrier. So while that's maybe not sort of clear cut kind of answer to the question, it's an important thing that we kind of consider, really, definitely.
Yeah, of course. So what additional benefits do you commonly see alongside flood risk reduction?
So primary ones, just off the top of my head, would be potential improvements to water quality and habitat creation and resilience building as well. Certainly everywhere that we've done any wetland creation elements, you see a wonderful abundance of life almost immediately, the kind of bird life and the insects and the mammals that are suddenly able to make use of this water and this habitat that's suddenly appeared in the landscape. But we also see, just as I said about the sort of fast responses to having timber in watercourses, you see a lot of changes, and you see a lot of where we've put interventions in where it's intercepting flowing water. You'll see a lot of not everywhere, but in a lot of instances, you'll see a lot of sort of silt and sediment and soil being impounded, being captured. That's then not making its way, excuse me, into the rest of the aquatic habitats downstream. It's not then flowing through and choking up sort of spawning gravels for fish and other elements, or carrying sort of phosphates into watercourses that ultimately assist in stripping the oxygen out of the water. While that's probably one little sort of subset of benefits of these types of schemes, it's quite easy for these things to be a multi-benefit, multifaceted sort of thing where you can almost start to list a huge amount of things from thinking about kind of broad carbon sequestration elements right down to looking at kind of the microbial life, microfilms, and other elements that are influenced by these sorts of interventions, really.
Yeah. So on the sort of other side of that, so what do you think are the limitations to natural flood management?
Well, as I said, it definitely needs a consideration of long-term management. It is not if you were putting up a concrete flood defence, that would come with a set, which the lifespan of concrete is about 20 years or something like that. You come with certain lines where you can expect a fairly rigid amount of lifespan of usability, functionality from that. And there's calculations that can be associated with it. What you don't get with nature-based solutions is those kind of guarantees. As I said, there seems to be a lot of pioneering research at the minute to explore those, but there's a lot. I mean, not to endlessly use leaky dams as an example, but there's a lot of different wood species that will break down at different rates, and is susceptible to different things once it's in water potentially, or has different sorts of influences. So it's difficult in a sense because you haven't got those clear. You can't look up a technical specification of this thing that we've put in would last for this amount. So it's very much sort of coming back to that long-term sort of view and engagement and continuing with the management.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
So how do you balance flood risk reduction with biodiversity and habitat restoration goals?
Okay, so I very much try and at a sort of design or concept stage try and think about how can we build in other elements that support those things. I mean, for example, we're about to embark upon, not that it's necessarily the right time of year to do this, but we're about to do some wetland creation work in West Cornwall, and we've woven in some wetland plug plants that have been factored into the project, so that we can, while we're undertaking some ground disturbance events, I shall say, that we're actually then injecting some species in there that will offer support for other elements. And the scheme that we're doing there will hold a lot of surface water. It will extend kind of wetland habitat viability, as if we look at in drought years and that sort of thing. But to kind of refine the example a bit more, there are marsh fritillary butterflies in the area, and there have been in the past. So we're going to put in quite a few plugs of Devil's Bit scabious, which is their target food plant for the caterpillars, and therefore alongside a project which, admittedly, it's not wholly focused on flood risk reduction, but in a functional sense, that's what it does. Yeah. We're also able to weave in those biodiversity and nature gain kind of elements in there as well. And I think it should always be a consideration of these schemes, because we're creating habitat and refuge at the same time.
Yeah, nice to sort of do both at the same time. Cool.
Precisely.
So we're on to our last question now. So what advice would you give to someone starting out in the industry?
Probably to try and get as much experience as possible. We to use a bit of an example here, we've a couple of our staff are relatively recent graduates, and they've got a lot of really strong kind of theory and analytical skills, and they're bringing a lot of sort of cutting edge knowledge to this. But the practical is often really quite important, because sometimes there's elements there that you don't necessarily get from a sort of textbook scenario. I'm not in any way saying that there's anything wrong there, but just that actually some of the practical experience can really help you to evolve that knowledge in a way that means when you come across different scenarios, as
Yeah.
as we do in this type of work, that then you can apply your knowledge in a more dynamic way. So I would say definitely trying to get experience. I would hope that going forward there will be sufficient kind of government and local authority support for these types of works, that they'll become more commonplace and there will be more opportunity for young people. But it sometimes it's being in the right place at the right time, and sometimes
Yeah.
it's just you have to keep trying to kind of get out there to go and see things.
Yeah.
But there's sometimes opportunities to develop skills. I mean, to reflect on my own background, after university, I spent a couple of years doing volunteering placements, which isn't ideal because you still need to earn money and that kind of thing. It's the balance, of course, particularly at the moment that has become a more acute and pressing kind of issue for many people, of course. But to sort of keep trying, really, I think to, not that I can speak for everyone in the industry, but those of us involved in this know that it is hugely important work, and getting more people on board and involved and expanding the sort of areas of influence in a geographical and otherwise sense is really important, and we need people to do that. We need people to come with us on that journey. Going forward, really.
Yeah, and if anything, it's going to just become more of a prevalent issue and be more important as time goes on. So, yeah. Well, thank you so much. That was really interesting. Thanks so much for your time. So, yeah.
That's okay. Thank you very much.
No problem.